good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar, which is sponsored by the California Fire Science Consortium and part of the Forest and Fire Ecology Random Lecture Series, or FARL, as we like to call it. My name is Tara Ursel, and I'm the host for today's webinar. I'm the coordinator for the Sierra Nevada region of the California Fire Science Consortium, which is a fire science outreach organization. Our mission includes increasing communication between fire researchers, managers, policymakers, tribes, landowners, homeowners, and other stakeholders. The California Fire Science Consortium is part of the nationwide Fire Science Exchange Network, which is funded through the Joint Fire Science Program and the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. So first, a few housekeeping items. So like I said, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted within the next week or so on our website and YouTube channel. If you're having any technical issues, please send me a private chat and I can help you once we get started. We'll also be using the chat function in Zoom to collect questions for Dr. Safford. So please feel free to type a question at any time and we'll just kind of address them in the order received. So many of you already know our speaker. Dr. Hugh Safford is the chief scientist of Vibrant Planet, which is an environmental public benefits corporation. And he's a research ecologist at the University of California, Davis. Before joining Vibrant Planet, Dr. Safford was regional ecologist for the USDA Forest Services Region 5, which includes California, Hawaii, and the Pacific Territories. And he was the regional ecologist between 2001 and 2021. He has provided international technical assistance on fire, forest management, and climate change issues since the 1990s. Dr. Safford is director of the Sierra Nevada section of the California Fire Science Consortium, this group, and the California Prescribed Fire Monitoring Program, which is a partnership with CAL FIRE. So, like I said, please feel free to post your questions for Dr. Safford at any time, and I'll keep track of them. And at the end, as we're kind of getting to the questions, I'm also going to post a link to a very short evaluation survey, which is really useful input for future webinars and helps us report back to our funders. And then we'll try to wrap up by 5 p.m. so we can get on with our days. So Dr. Safford, Hugh, I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Tara, appreciate it. Yeah, and I just want to underline what Tara just said. We really, really appreciate it if you can go in and fill in one of those response forms, reference forms, because our funders like Joint Fire Science, for example, are really requiring that stuff to make sure that people are enjoying or not enjoying what we're doing. So we all have a good idea of the efficacy and how useful what we're doing is. Anyway, Tara and I talked about, I've been talking about doing a reprise of this presentation for a lot of years. I had forgotten. I last did one about 10 years ago, and when yesterday came and it was time for me to start thinking at the last minute about what I was going to put together for this, I thought, oh God, there's got to be something on my computer. And wouldn't you know, I found something from 2010 or 11. That's not the exact presentation I'm giving. Don't worry, I have updated it with some new graphics and some new ideas, but that basically saved me. So anyway, I will, let's see, I'll pull up my presentation. What I'm planning to do is to kind of work my way through a presentation, hopefully solicit some discussion, questions and answers. And then if there's a little bit of time, I'll probably pull up my GIS and just show you one of the products, the one that we've cut out for the Lake Tahoe Basin, so you can see some of the data in action. All righty, let's see here. Where is this presentation? Okay, there it is. So Tara, tell me, are you seeing the, you're probably seeing the, hold on just a sec. Are you seeing the presentation now?
It's in presentation mode. So now that's good.
Got it? Okay, very cool. Yeah. All right, anyway, that's what I'm talking about. I'll go on to the next one. So there's some words in the first couple of slides. This is available afterwards too, and I figured I would err on the side of being a little bit too verbose, so that, I guess this isn't verbose, or writing a little bit too much so people had access to the information afterwards. But basically, in terms of an abstract of what I'm going to talk about, I'm talking about a spatial data set. It's called the California Fire Return Interval Departure Geodatabase. And what it does is it incorporates information that we've compiled about current and historical fire return intervals for major vegetation types that are found on the 18 national forests. And then on adjacent land jurisdictions, for example, we also map Yosemite National Park and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park. And I'll explain, we're expanding the mapping in the future as well. In the database, we make comparisons between pre-Euroamerican settlement and contemporary fire return intervals, and there are a whole bunch of metrics in there. Somebody out there should put on their mute. I'm hearing discussions. Anyway, and just in the way of acknowledgements, the FRID database is a joint project of UC Davis. We've had some funding from CAL FIRE, we built this work originally when I still worked for the Forest Service Pacific Southwest region. And the scripting and coding was actually done by the erstwhile Remote Sensing Lab, which is now called the Mapping and Remote Sensing, or MARS staff for Region 5. So basically, in terms of methods, I'll go through this very, very quickly, but what we did was we spent a couple of years compiling information because these days there are even more, and we continue to compile this information. And as we find information, we're changing the actual variables that are behind the data that are behind the data set as well. But we compiled information for years on, from the fire history literature. There were some workshops that we had, and we took advantage of workshops from other organizations, talked to a lot of experts, did some modeling. And then, so that was for the pre-settlement fire return intervals. And the contemporary FRIs are taken from the California Fire Perimeters Database, which is managed by FRAP at CAL FIRE, which also includes prescribed fires if they were reported to CAL FIRE. And that's a big if, because a lot of the smaller prescribed fires are not reported. And for the most part, private lands are not reported either. Then the vegetation type stratification and the mapping that forms the basis or the fundament on which we're doing our calculations is the eVeg map for California, but it's from the year 2011, and I'll explain why that is. And then what we've done is we've taken the CalVeg classification typing, which is what's attached to the eVeg maps, and we've crosswalked those into these pre-settlement fire regime types that Kip Van Water and I defined in a paper in 2011. And I'll be speaking about these processes in a little more depth. So the reason that we use the 2011 eVeg map as the baseline is because we wanted to freeze the underlying vegetation template, because vegetation changes over time. And for example, you can have an area where it's conifer ground, it always was conifer, but it's burned a couple of times in the last 7 or 8 years. Regeneration is all killed, and it looks like it might be grassland for a while. But it really seems crazy to just decide that that's grassland if indeed it can actually climatically and pedologically support forest. So this is a problem you run into when you talk about reference mapping of all kinds, is this idea of site potential. So ideally, in order to be able to use this really as a restoration tool, we would have some kind of a potential natural vegetation map behind this. But the big issues with P&V maps are, one, that most of the original P&V maps, in fact, that were being done when I came into the Forest Service at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, essentially ignored fire as an ecological process. It's kind of amazing to think about that was only, 20, 21 years ago, 22 years ago at this point. And we were barely thinking about fire in those days. It kind of blows my mind to think about the Sierra Nevada framework in those days, the original version, and how it nearly ignored fire as an ecological process. But we don't ignore it anymore. But then, of course, any of these maps always have issues with spatial accuracy. Sometimes there are vegetation typing issues, et cetera. Anyway, so we've been talking with Landfire for at this point 2 decades about rebuilding some of the Landfire products, and I can't get them interested, and I just cannot find money to do it. So anyway, we're still searching for money to develop a more robust P&V map. But again, this is something I'll talk about in a little more depth later on. So in terms of the purpose, the reason we built this thing is because there are a lot of very important reasons to understand the history of a site, whether or not you're actually trying to manage your current site to be just like it was in 1615 or 1750, which I don't really recommend necessarily. But the historical information still is absolutely necessary. The old adage, you don't know where you're going until you know where you've been is very, very important and to everything that we do on land management. So, everything from resource planning and assessment to fuels treatment planning to restoration, management response to fire, and just generally understanding what's going on in our forests. For example, I find that a classic example is, if you look at some of the recent severe fire years we've had, or intense fire years we've had, with a lot of fire in the landscape, and all you do is read all of this, hyperbole in the literature, and even coming out of politicians' mouths, and even at our agency leadership mouths sometimes about everything that's burning up. And what you need to do is stop, take a breath, and go back and look at history of burning in California, and you realize that the year 2020, which was characterized as an absolute catastrophe and disaster and hell by everyone, that was a normal year in terms of the area of fire that burned in California. If you take California as a unit over the last 5,000 to 10,000 years. Certainly the fires were very severe, but in terms of fire area, it wasn't anything outside the normal. And what's been abnormal is all the other years in which we've excluded fire from the landscape. You wouldn't know that if you didn't know something about history. So anyway, we feel as if the geodatabase is a really important data source for any sort of strategy or project that's seeking to restore fire regimes or ecological conditions that are affected by them. The other thing about fire frequency is, there are a bunch of different components of a fire regime, right? But fire frequency and severity are the ones that mostly get used in defining fire regimes. And there's a good reason for that, because both of them can be mapped, both of them can be calculated, and both of them are relatively easy to understand, right? So anyway, okay. So I just wanted to make a couple of acknowledgements. First of all, that the work that we did starting in the early 2000s on this owes a large debt of gratitude to folks who were working, and in some cases still are working, in the National Parks Service in the mid-1990s. And chief among them were Tony Caprio and Mary Beth Kiefer. But Jan van Wagdendonk, who passed away last year, also was important in extending these methodologies to Yosemite National Park. And I'll note that within our FRID database, we do include a couple of the original National Park Service measures of FRID, which are different somewhat from the ones that we added to the database. Secondly, was that once we had spent a lot of time talking to the National Service about what they were doing and what the benefits and limitations were of the metrics they were using, we carried out a pilot project, and that was in the Southern Sierra Nevada surrounding those parks. And this was a joint project between the Nature Conservancy California chapter and the Ecology Program, which I was managing at that time. And I just wanted to acknowledge David Schmidt, who some of you might know. He's a SIG employee these days, but lives on his farm in Iowa. And Dave worked for me for 3 years as a cost share ecologist with the TNC. And then finally, I want to acknowledge Kip Vandewater, who at the time that he was working with me had just come out of Malcolm North's lab, where he'd done a master's, and he worked for me for a little more than a year as a postgraduate researcher. And he did most of the really extensive background research that we had to do to be able to compile information on the reference FRIs. And so I'll just note that these are the two papers that are the principal sources of what I'm going to talk about. One is a paper that Kip and I wrote and published in 2011 that summarized fire frequency estimates for California vegetation, woody vegetation types, before Euro-American settlement. I mean, Kip worked his way through nearly 300 publications, and this thing was astounding. And then in 2014, after Kip had moved back to the agency, he helped me build a research paper from the Forest Service research side that summarized the spatial tool that we developed and some of the analyses we did. And I put down there at the bottom that together the two of them have been cited more than 330 times in the scientific literature. So that's cool. It makes one feel good that people are using, or I guess potentially misusing, this information. Okay, so first of all, where are the data? Okay, so that's the website where one goes to get the FRID data. And that's at the Forest Service GIS Data Clearinghouse. And then you go and you click on the state level data sets. And I'm going to show some screenshots here in a second. And then the databases are available for each of the eVeg map tiles. And you'll see the point is that the data are big enough that it has to be split up into map tiles. We will figure something out with that in the near future. You know, with all the cloud-based stuff that we can do, we can probably just post a single data set next time we do this, I would think. I want to note that the coverage is for regions in California that have some component of Forest Service lands in them. So the Central Valley is missing in the data set. There are some gaps in the Central Coast Range, particularly around the Bay Area and south of the Bay Area towards San Luis Obispo. There are a couple of big holes in there. And then there is almost no information out of the deserts. And as I will explain at the end of this presentation, we are rectifying that. And then there's a metadata document associated with it. So here's a screenshot of the Geospatial Data website. You can see the state level data sets tab down at the bottom left. You just click on that and that sends you to this. And you can see there's fire return interval departure, all the different tiles that are in here. You can download the tiles. And if you click on this eye, it'll provide you the metadata document. Okay, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to work my way through the data table in the geodatabase to explain to you the data types that are in there, how we calculated them, and then there'll be a little bit more of a discussion about what this all means and how we use it, et cetera. So I'm not going to cover any of these. The first, I think I list about 12 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12. There are more. I think there might be 16 lines of data. These are all from the eVeg map. So they're not necessarily up to date anymore because, like I said, we've frozen the background as the 2011 map. It includes, you know, what is the cover type, what is the CalVeg type. I mean, those are all pretty reasonable, but it's got diameters, you know, cover classes, things like that. I wouldn't trust that information any longer, and I guess we could theoretically even have that removed. But it has WHR life form, WHR type, and those should be as well. That's the California Wildlife Habitat Relations Vegetation Classification, which if you've been working in California for any time, you'll know that might be the most widely used vegetation classification in the state across all of the different agencies. You know, I better write that down. I'm just realizing that it probably makes sense to remove the cover information and everything so people don't start thinking that's actually up to date. The dominance types and stuff I think are fine. All right. Okay, so in terms of the data fields there, the first one you run into is year of last fire, and that's the year in which the polygon in question last experienced a fire. That was recorded in the fire perimeter database, and this is from the fire perimeter data set that the state builds. And so I should note that that data set usually comes out in about May, depends on the year, you know, sometimes might be a little bit later. And then once that comes out, then folks over at RSL or Mars now have a set of scripts that they run on the fire perimeter database, and then they post the FRID tiles, usually by sometime in June. A couple of years it's been a little bit later because, you know, someone retired, et cetera. I should also, by the way, acknowledge Carol Clark, who retired, but worked as a contractor for the remote sensing lab for a long time, and she's the one who wrote all the scripts. I want to note that, and this again I'll talk about at the end of the presentation, but I'll highlight here, you know, the California Fire Perimeter Database is easily the most complete fire perimeter database on the planet for anything approaching the size of California. There's nothing else really like it. It's not a perfect record though, and I think all of us can consider it more or less very accurate after the Second World War. But the Forest Service mandated collection of information, spatial location and size information on fires starting in 1908. And there was when the fire perimeter database was first developed, there was a lot of time spent in collecting and collating and understanding all the data sets that were available on fire sizes, locations, and shapes. And then some work was done with aerial photos as well. Now, it's proven difficult to find money to continue that work because, for example, I have been shown areas in California, for example, in the San Bernardino Mountains, where some relatively sizable fires, even since the 50s, somehow didn't get into the data set. I asked the Forest Service units down there for help, and they just never provided it. We were never able to actually get those fires digitized. So, it's a high cost, right? You doing that for a bunch of single fires. In terms of its real payoff, it's tough to say what the statewide payoff is, but local payoff could be high. Anyway, if you know anything, if you are running through the data set, you find issues, it would be great if you could let us know, and we can pass that information on to FRID. And also, I'll note that we do use prescribed fires in the data set. And so if prescribed fires are getting into the fire perimeter database, into the tab, then they're being considered in our analysis. The next one is time since last fire. And so this is simply the number of years elapsed between the most recent fire that's in the fire perimeters database and the version year. So if the version year of the FRID map is 2021, which is the most recent one that's up currently, and the reason that is because the 2022 fires are going to come out in May, right? And once they come out in May, then June of this year is when you'll be able to get hold of the 2022 version. So that, in this case, the TSLF would be 26 years. And then, here's an old one. So most of the stuff I was going to show is the Lake Tahoe Basin because I've been working on a project there recently, but the Lake Tahoe Basin has a really boring fire history. It doesn't have much fire except over the course of since about 2002, there's been a little bit. So I'm just showing an old picture I had in the old original presentation from the Tahoe National Forest in 2010. As you all probably know, this lower half of the Tahoe is going to be covered in fire if you did a more recent one. Sorry, I just didn't have time to deal with it. But that's kind of what that maps. What I've done is I've just classified them into 10-year classes. The next field is number of fires. And so this has been calculated for you. So any polygon that you click on in there is going to tell you on that polygon how many fires were in there between 1908 and the version year that you're looking at. Okay. So one thing you should note is that one of the limitations of the fire perimeter data set is that, first of all, the different agencies report different sizes. The Forest Service has historically reported smaller fires than the state agencies. And also that in general, fires less than 4 hectares or 10 acres are all in there after 1950, but mostly only less than up to above 100 acres prior to 1950. So anyway, again, there's a little bit of a discrepancy in which fires are missing depending on the time period that you use. And again, here's the Tahoe National Forest. This is a 2010 snapshot. And sorry, but this gives you an idea of kind of what you can get. And this isn't very pretty. I could have brought the DEM under it and made it look like it had some landscape, but this is just showing you parts of the landscape where you can see where there's a surfeit of fires. And as you can see in most of the unit, there's none. So pre-settlement fire regime is the next field. This is from the Vandewater and Safford paper that we published in Fire Ecology. And this is crosswalked from the current vegetation type, in this case, CalVeg. Sometimes we'll use the land fire backdrops, and we have crosswalks from the land fire data sets as well. And I can show you, in fact, I think one of the next few slides shows one of those. But this is to its probable historical fire regime, right? And by historical, we mean more or less the 3 or 4 centuries before Euro-American settlement, which is where almost all of the fire scar data come from. And so each pre-settlement fire regime type is named for the dominant vegetation type that's supported by that PFR. Right now, there are 28 of them in FRID. They're based on the land fire biophysical settings, which are potential natural vegetation types modeled with fire. Those were built in the early 2000s, and I was heavily involved in a lot of the work to build the catalog of those types for California. And those are not just vegetation types, but they actually include a state in transition fire and forest growth model, a simple one associated with them, and information on vegetation, locations, environment, and fire regimes. And then we took that information and added to it information that we got from a variety of different resources. But I didn't note this here, but like I said, we also spent, once we defined them, we spent a lot of time casing or talking to fire and forest experts in the state. We heard back from a couple dozen people and made some modifications based on their input. Currently, we're developing some new BPSs. To this point, we've only focused on woody types, but in the future, we will have grass and we will fill out the shrub catalog as well. So this is one of the crosswalks. This is part of the crosswalk table that's in Vandewater and Safford, and it gives you an idea of land fire biophysical settings and how they crosswalk to PFR types. And then this is a crosswalk that we use for crosswalking from CalVeg types to the PFRs. And again, this is much longer than this. This is just a screenshot of the first page. Okay, so here's a map of PFR types. This is from the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit, and this is the 2021 version. Although, like I said, this is frozen based on the 2011 veg map. And the types are crosswalked from the CalVeg classification system, which is the Forest Service system. And so this is a snapshot then of these pre-settlement fire regimes, but they are not mapped in 1850. They're mapped in 2011. And we can talk about the challenges of that you'll run into thinking about that and how to use it. Okay, so here are a couple of things I wanted to cover. I guess I could have put this at the end, but this is one of the biggest issues with a tool like this is, obviously the efficacy, the accuracy of any tool you build is going to depend on the resolution and the accuracy of the data that you feed into the tool, right? And so in a lot of areas in California, there's really very little reliable information on the pre-settlement distribution of vegetation typing. I think the best example is in Southern California, but also along the coast, because there was a massive amount of human-driven disturbance to those systems for thousands and thousands of years, even before Euro-American settlement. And now today, of course, Southern California is, the mix of lightning to human ignitions is like 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, whereas the rest of the state, it's about 1 to 1. So anyway, that's why we decided that to build this thing, we really needed to use a current vegetation map, because it's just difficult really to believe any of these potential model vegetation maps where there was all this. And this is the same thing in the southeastern US. People there complain as well about some of the land fire outputs, for example, because there was such huge human influence on everything there. And this just does not get modeled out in a model. It doesn't come out in a model vegetation map. So some of the issues, like, for example, in Southern California, almost all these are from SoCal, but, big cone Douglas fir stands now have converted to chaparral because because of a lack of fire for a long time. And now chaparral has invaded those sites, and now when they burn really hot, which essentially exacerbates the same situation. A lot of places in Southern California, chaparral and sage scrub have converted to grassland under very high recent fire frequencies, but a lot of the landscape, particularly toward the coast, burned way more often historically in more controlled burns or uncontrolled, set by Native Americans, right? And so a lot of grassland, when you read the Spanish diaries, for example, from the 1700s, you realize that a huge part of Southern California was annually burned grassland. For example, Camp Pendleton today, which is all chaparral, was all grassland in the 1760s. And also desert vegetation types that now burn frequently, never burned before, but now they've been invaded by, mustards and grasses, et cetera, and that kind of stuff. Big question, how do you deal with effects of Native American burning? And I'm in the process of negotiating the arrival of a new postdoc on campus to help me think about how we might deal with that in the FRID data set. Anyway. So the reason this is such a big issue is because the base vegetation layer is really important, right, to any analysis that you do in this respect, right? So human land use changes, high frequency or high severity fire, or the lack of fire, climate change, all this stuff can change it. So some of the things we've thought about, for example, are using the 1930s Forest Service vegetation maps as the base layer, because that was much closer to the beginning of fire exclusion, for example, and a lot of the landscape had not been as degraded as it is today, although some of the landscape had been more degraded than it is today. We could also use the land fire biophysical settings map, but how do you incorporate changing climate and all that stuff? And then finally, I want to note that at this point, we're ignoring grasslands, meadows, and riparian vegetation because, fire return intervals and departure statistics, we just don't have that stuff, because information on how these systems functioned and what their fire regimes like, that information is very qualitative and very difficult to subject to any sort of validation. Anyway, we're working with experts around the state, Don Hankins, for example, at Chico State and other places, to try to get information that is quote unquote believable there, and then we'll try to incorporate that into our next version. Oh, sorry about that. So here are some examples of what I'm talking about. So this is a really crappy screenshot. Sorry. Again, this is a 2010 map, but this is essentially the WHR types crosswalked to our pre-fire settlement, pre-settlement fire regime types. And this is the Tahoe National Forest. And so this is current. And then if you just go back, so there it is with the crosswalk done from the Forest Service maps in 1934. And we kind of toggle back and forth a few times. You can see they're really different. And so which one is right? I mean, under a frequent fire regime, a lot of the Tahoe National Forest would have supported dry mixed conifer and yellow pine forests that had a high frequency, fire regime. What we have today instead is an area where it's almost all gone to the green colors, which is mixed conifer, which has a slightly less frequent fire regime and a different, a little bit different in terms of the fire severity and patchiness and all that as well. So, that's your question. I mean, what's your reference? And we're continuing to think about that. But, the older data set, okay, it's 90 years ago. Climate was cooler. Some places less degradation, some places more degradation. At that point in time, fire exclusion was still young, but it was much coarser scale mapping. I mean, this stuff is done, I don't remember what the minimum mapping unit for CalVeg or EVeg was in 2010. It was probably about an acre. Minimum mapping unit on this one is probably hundreds of acres, right? It was done, on horseback. And it's also not California-wide. Another thing, too, is climate change, right? So here, this is courtesy of work that Jim Thorne did. Here is the crosswalk to WHR types from the Forest Service mapping in the 1930s. And here's what it looks like today using the modern EVeg map. And you can see, expansion of oak-dominated types, all over in the foothills in here, basically. You can also see a loss of blue oak types of the woodland that's being lost mostly to urban expansion. And you can see that here, the light green here is ponderosa pine. And a lot of that is gone now. A lot of it was cut, but essentially it's transitioned into Sierra mixed conifer and white fir types because of succession in the absence of fire, right? You can also see that obviously, like I said before too, you have to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt because these were different kinds of mapping. But you can also see that there's a loss in this blue stuff up here is, the orange stuff is subalpine vegetation. And you can see that it, according to this mapping comparison, that it has decreased and that some of that's been invaded by red fir. And then other things is that when you get a new fire, the vegetation changes immediately. But, this is chaparral and this is going to be chaparral again in just a few years. So do we pretend like there's nothing there? You know what I mean? So anyway, you have to make decisions about what quote unquote a landscape should and could support and not constantly change it as the conditions underfoot change. Okay, the next field is fire regime group. This is just the standard National Fire Plan fire regime group. I'm sure you guys have all seen these. This is a table with those types 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 based on fire return intervals and the dominant fire severity classes. So you can pull that info out and I can show a graphic of that here in a minute. The next one is the current fire return interval. That's calculated simply based on the number of years in the data set between your version year in 1908 divided by the number of fires plus 1. Note that there are fires in the CAL FIRE data set before 1908, but they're really, really spotty. And so we decided just not to use those. So here's the current fire return interval map for the Tahoe National Forest in 2010. Obviously, this would look quite a bit different today. The southern third of the forest has had a notable amount of fire on it over the course of the last 13 years. Okay, so now we're getting into the interesting stuff. So here's the next one is the mean reference fire return interval. Basically, this is an approximation of how often, when we're talking about means here, that a PFR likely burned in the 3 to 4 centuries prior to significant Euro-American settlement. This comes out of Vandewater and Safford, but in some cases, we've got some newer data. In fact, in a lot of cases we have, mostly they're just extra data substantiating what we already summarized, but in some cases there have been some minor changes. These are almost all from small scale composite fire histories. And I'm not going to go into, there is some sediment record and some charcoal, other stuff that's been done as well. In some cases, we used modeling data where we had little other data, but composite fire histories it's the way to go. I'm not going to sit here and describe why that is. We can talk about it later on if you want, but I think that literature is pretty much substantiated. This is the way to go. And I'll note that it's not just mean, but we also do median, mean min, and mean max reference fire return intervals. And here's the table from Van Water and Safford for the 28 types. And then here's the Lake Tahoe Basin. So here's the reference values based on the PFRs and the fire return interval data that are out there. And you can see that almost all the landscape had fire return intervals that were less than 20 years, and a lot of it close, less than 15 years. And you can see today that the landscape basically just doesn't ever burn. And that the only burning that we've seen are a handful of fires that we've lost control of over just really the last couple of years. And that would be the Caldor fire from 21, Angora fire 07, Gondola and Showers fire from 2002, and then a couple that were earlier on. And this is the Emerald fire from 2018. Okay, so then we get into the calculation. So this is mean PFRID, and this is a measure of the extent to which fires today, and when I say that, I mean since 1908, are burning at frequencies similar to frequencies that occurred before Euro-American settlement. So the important thing to understand is that, and this is how it differs from the National Park Service measures that I'll talk about in a little bit, is that it does not return to zero when a fire occurs. And the reason we did this was because for those of us who work in restoration, we understand that a single entry into a stand is not restoration. It takes a lot of work and it's a long-term commitment. And restoring fire regimes don't happen when you have one burn on a site. In fact, usually if you get one burn on a site after 100 years without fire, it's the antithesis of restoration. It usually wipes the stand out and we need to start all over. So what you'll find if you try to use mean PFRID as a measure of success in reintroducing fire in the landscape is you're not going to move it until you've done 3 or 4 fires on the landscape. And this is the calculation. I won't go into this, but it's turned into a negative calculation when the current fire return interval is shorter than the reference interval. Most of Northern California, this is the case where the current fire return interval is longer or much longer than the reference. But in a lot of places in Southern California, in the Bay Area, and some places in the Sierra foothills now, we're seeing enough burning that we're actually seeing what we think is more, and in some cases notably more burning than these systems probably saw before 1850. If you've got a PFR where the mean reference FRI is greater than the time between your data year and 1908, so for the last version of FRID, it would be 113 years, we just set FRID to 0 because we basically can't analyze a type that's got a longer fire return interval than that. I thought there was a graphic there. Oh, I guess I accidentally got rid of it. And then we can do a condition class of this as well. And that's just classifying the PFRID data into 3 classes, a low departure, a moderate departure, and a high departure. And we also do that for negative condition classes where we have too much burning. And I'll explain that again here in a little bit. So, oh boy, that is a shocking one. Sorry about the colors. But anyway, this gives you an idea of this is the mean, the condition class developed off of the mean PFRID, this is the main condition class that people use when they use this in the Forest Service. And you can see that the Tahoe National Forest is horribly departed in 2010. Some of it down here is going to might be yellow at this point. But it takes in a system like in here, most of these are going to be, originally yellow pine and dry mixed conifer types, maybe some wet mixed conifer. But I mean, you've missed 5 to 10 fire return intervals in these systems. And you're not going to be moving it from red to yellow without at least a couple of fires in each of those sites. And you're not going to get into your green. We consider -1 to 1 sort of being in the realm of what we want to be pushing for on landscapes. It's going to take 3, 4, 5 fires to get it there using this measure. There are a couple of things you can do. You can use, this is using the minimum condition class. And in other words, this is the minimum max, the mean minimum fire return interval. And you can see in this case, the whole landscape is massively departed. But if you really want to know where it's really extremely departed, you can use the maximum FRI, which is obviously a lot more conservative. But if you're working on a really big landscape and you want to land in those places where you really have fire return interval issues, then you can use this one. Then we have the NPS FRID measures. And by the way, I'm almost through this. I'm going to show some stuff on, and we'll go through a discussion that I can show you what's in the Lake Tahoe Basin. And this was developed by the National Park Service. And this is a simple one. This is taking the maximum. This was, okay, this was their original one. They use mean now. I need to change this, but basically they're using the reference fire return interval. They subtract the time since last fire and they divide it out by the reference interval. So it only is considering the time since the last fire, right? It's not considering the long-term history of the stand. And then the FRID index just takes the numbers you get out of this and it turns them into classes, whereas values below -5 are considered extreme, values towards 0 are considered low. And this is the value that they've been using the Park Service for a really long time. So here is the NPS FRID and the NPS FRID index. And you can see, whereas, you know, when you looked at the current fire return interval departure or for current fire return interval in the Lake Tahoe Basin, you could see that there'd been almost no fire in the whole landscape except right down here. But you can see that with the FRID index that it actually shows this as very low departure simply because this was a single burn that occurred relatively recently. People who are trying to measure impacts of their treatment on the ground tend to like the Park Service measures a lot more because it only takes one fire to be able to go woohoo. Let's see. Okay. And then this is the FRID index from 2010 for the Tahoe National Forest. And you can see almost all of it is extreme because there hadn't been a fire in there for a very long time. So you can do a bunch of other interesting things. And I really like these. And we're going to, when this postdoc comes on, we're going to redo the 2014 GTR because I think it's high time to do this again. But we did a report card for the Forest Service units, Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon in California. And this is the % of the area on each of those units that is in each of these condition classes. And so here, this is catastrophic exclusion of fire, not so bad. Green is okay, we're looking good. And the blues are, hey, you got too much fire in the landscape. And you can see how different parts of the state are. Here's the Angeles, Cleveland, Los Padres, and San Bernardino National Forests, all in SoCal. And you can see they are dominated by landscapes that are burning more often than those vegetation types can probably support. And then if you go to places like any of the Sierra Nevada forests or Northern California, you can see that they are hugely dominated by areas that are way out of whack, that just have not seen fire. Now, mind you, this is the plumas. In 2014, we were using data from, I forget, probably 2011 or 12. I don't think it would look quite like this anymore. There's been a lot of burning in the area of the Feather River, of the North Fork of the Feather River in particular. But so that's by area, and this is by total hectares. And you can see that in this graphic, the most departed forest that had the biggest lack of fire was the Plumas, but in terms of area, it's by far the Shasta Trinity National Forest. And you can see that the park system, in terms of % of area, is doing very, very well. The only ones that are even close to them in the Sierra Nevada is the Inyo, and there's a good reason for that. Is that because the Inyo has a very active fire use program where they're doing a lot of burning using wildland fire ignitions. All right. Okay. Now this is another thing that we did was we took the PFRID measures across the state and we generalized them to the ecological subsection boundaries. Excluded from these maps types where I forget what the limit was. There had to be at least some % of Forest Service lands in the subsection to be generalized to the boundary. But this just makes it a little bit easier to see the big differences between Northern California and Southern California. And you can see that in the north, the big issue is lack of fire, especially in the Northern Sierra and the South Cascades. And in the south, the big issue is more fire than these systems can probably handle, at least in their current status of being largely, for example, shrubland dominated. You can see also in Southern California that there are a couple of sky islands here, San Gabriel's, San Bernardino's, and San Jacinto's, that are acting like the Sierra Nevada. Well, that's because they are. The vegetation there is Sierra Nevadan. Those are mountains that reach, 11,000 feet in some cases. And although they're lacking red fir, everything else is essentially a snapshot of what you would see at similar elevations in the Sierra Nevada. And in those systems, there's actually, again, a lack of fire because those were the lightning-driven systems largely, and those fires have been put out in those systems for the last 100 years. I think there's another. Oh yeah, I just wanted to note that the Safford Van de Water thing, there's a bunch of little analyses in there, and you can see that those places that have high negative departures, i.e. Southern California, are places with real high population density. predominant fire return intervals that were relatively high in the woody types. Remember, only analyzing woody vegetation. Had a lot of frost-free days. So these are warm, dry areas with relatively low precipitation and also low elevation, whereas the systems that are departed in the other direction, you're not seeing fire, tend to be higher elevation, they're wetter, and they're colder, and lower population densities with a lot of lightning ignitions. Anyway, so he just took some examples. So the ecology program depends on the province or the zone you're talking about. But I know that, for example, in Southern California and Northwestern California, the province programs there on a regular basis generate reports. I don't know if they do it every year, but they'll do it. Like this was for the Los Padres National Forest in 2010. You know, what's the mean reference fire return interval for the unit? What's the current fire return interval? What's the time since last fire? That'd be a great trivia question to see if anyone on the call can remember the names of any of these fires from the, between 2005 and 10. Mean condition class, NPS fire return interval, et cetera, all that kind of stuff. So I just have some things I wanted to just discuss. So some of the caveats, when you're thinking about these. So, one of the real big questions is, what is the role of human ignitions before Euro-American settlement? And as I noted before, the coast ranges, lowlands like the coast, Central Valley, and foothills of the Sierra Nevada and Southern California mountains, for example, there were a lot of Native American ignitions in those systems. So, currently the systems are dominated by chaparral, at least where they were 20, 30 years ago. And our measures of departure are based on the fact that those systems are quote unquote chaparral. And so they're burning too much to support chaparral any longer. And that obviously is going to have impacts on water provision, soil loss, biodiversity, smoke, you name it. But the fact is that, when the Spanish first showed up and viewed this system that had been shaped over thousands of years by Native Americans, a huge part of that landscape was getting burned on an annual or maybe every couple of years basis. And a lot of the landscape that's currently chaparral probably wasn't historically. So I don't know what the answer is there. But we could get into real heated fistfights with some folks in SoCal about that, but that would be fun to chat about, but not on this call. Also, some scalar issues. So, you have regional and local variability within the PFRs and their reference values. And so, we've classified things, which is what humans do, right? But when you call something a yellow pine and you call a yellow pine what's going on in the Klamath and yellow pine what's going on in San Diego County, obviously there's some different species in there. One is a lot drier than the other one, probably, even though we can say that, in average, the fire regime supported fires every 0 to make up a number 15 years across that whole type. It might be more skewed toward the low end in part of the range and more to the, the high end in another part of the range. You can always input your own info into this platform, though, and do your own analyses if you want to. We really recommend that people use the raw departure metrics rather than condition class, because condition classes we're already classifying things and these box them up. Like having just 3 condition classes I don't think it tells you a lot. I mean, you don't know whether a type is sitting right at the bottom of a condition class box or the top of it. So we recommend using the actual PFRID values. Another one is the temporal scale. One of the issues is that we've recently tried to rectify is this idea that, our current data is based on considerations of what's happened after 1908, but forest, fire management in the U.S. has gone through a bunch of different philosophical and operational stages in that period. I mean, probably the most important one was, the end of the 60s, early 70s, where everyone all of a sudden realized, whoa, fire is an ecological force, and we need to think about how we work with it, not against it. We transitioned from full fire suppression to ecological fire management, and all of a sudden there was a thing called the Wild and Fire Use Program, right? Which I don't know what we call it these days. They change the name every few years, but resource benefit fires or something. But because of that, the way we manage fires changed dramatically in 1970, and then it changed again after the National Fire Plan in 2000, which told us, nah, screw this ecological stuff. We need to worry about human assets. And then 2009, they stopped wild and fire use fires altogether and said you can manage any fire any way you want as long as you can justify it. So I don't know. The point is that the 1970 we felt was an important enough date that what we've done now is we've added these statistics for just since 1970 as well. So, for example, here's a good example. I think that if you look at like Yosemite versus this forest around it, it's you'd be surprised at how similar the fire departure statistics look in them, because they're all being calculated since 1908. And Yosemite was also engaged in full fire suppression from 1908 until about 1970, when it stopped that, more or less. If you run this analysis using our statistics, our metrics calculated since 1970, it shows a drastic difference between the units. By the way, we also provide another new statistic, and that is the number of fires in the last 40 years. And then that'll just get recalculated every, just for the 40 years as we move forward. And the reason for that is that in shrubland landscapes, particularly chaparral and sagebrush, that sustained fire return intervals that are less than 15, in particular less than 10, but less than 15, that's an alarm bell. You start to lose species on those landscapes, especially obligate seeding species. And so by 40 years, if you get 3 fires in 40 years, you're below that. And so we figured that that's a way for us to quickly understand whether or not we need to be worried about sustainability. There are always data quality issues. I've talked about some of these. There's a lot of variability within the PFRs. I just explained one to you, yellow pine. There are fire perimeter data issues. Those have to be resolved at the level of the FRAP data. And we've worked with them on trying to resolve some of those, and they're generally really responsive. RX burning data, that's really spotty. Their older data are basically missing. Agency data are in there for bigger fires. A lot of the teeny fires aren't in there. Probably wouldn't make a difference at the scale of the state, but it would regionally. Vegetation mapping issues, we talked about these already, potential versus existing. Different maps have different accuracies and resolutions. And also you've got changing vegetation over time that we need to think about how to deal with that. And then my last 2 slides, I think, in terms of management use, using a tool like this can provide you a preliminary or sort of a broad scale evaluation of restoration need. You need to know what else is going on in the landscape, but this is a quick way of doing it. I mean, you can quickly ID places that have had fire frequencies that are within or near the natural range of variation. For example, using techniques that like Malcolm North and Van Kane and other folks have developed to look at reference, what we'll call, current reference areas and systems. I mean, this is kind of your first filter, right? Let's find those places that have had X number of fires in, some period of time. And this data set does that for you. Also, you can use it to monitor fire use, whether you're talking about RX burn or wildland fire impacts, but it's best to use a mix of PFRID and NPS. One is long-term, one is short-term. One of the things we found is we've extended this now to the Western US with some Forest Service colleagues. And we're finding places in the Western US where I think we need to start to be worried about wildland fire use in high elevation forests. I've seen this in the Sierra Nevada too, where burning has gone on and, foxtail pine and stuff. And all of a sudden now we've got places that have had 2, 3, relatively severe fires in the last 15, 20 years, where those systems were not burning that often historically. And it might be time to think about backing off a little bit and actually using wildland fire use where it's going to make a difference at moderate and lower elevations. I'm not saying it's a problem everywhere, but we've seen it in the Northern Rockies. It was very surprising to folks when we did this analysis up there and they found a bunch of red polygons where they thought, oh my God, look, we've had 3 fires in these spruce fir systems in the last 15, 20 years. I talked about the mean maximum thing. Also, we're not trying to suggest that pre-European settlement fire regime is necessarily a reasonable goal for restoration. I mean, it could be if you decide it is, and you and your stakeholders decide it is, then go for it. But that's not what we're trying to suggest. We're just trying to provide historical context for people to do management. Also, fire frequency is only one component, right, of the fire regime. You shouldn't ignore information on fire severity, on patch sizes, and things like that. And then finally, I got funded about a year ago, a little more than a year ago now, by CAL FIRE to expand FRID to all California lands. And I think I finally have located a postdoc to help me do that. So I'm excited. I think in a year and a half, we'll have it for every part of California. We're going to add some new metrics, for example, metrics on the number of years between fires. We're also defining some new PFRs, adding grass and desert. We're going to probably develop a new base map. That's going to be sticky. That'll take us a while, and we'll probably be contacting some of you all. We also would like to do a statewide follow-up to Safford and Vandewater 2014 as just sort of taking the pulse of where fire is in the state. And then finally, we've recommended to the National Wildfire Risk Assessment Data Team that I've been working with them for about the last half year in generating data stacks to do wildfire risk assessments nationally. And they are seriously considering adding a national FRID layer. So yeah, I think we're probably close to the end here, right? So I don't think I'll show the rest of my stuff. So anyway, were there any questions that came in?